Welcome to the inaugural Stephen W. Bosworth Memorial Lecture in Diplomacy at Harvard Kennedy School. We will begin today with a short video tribute to Ambassador Bosworth, and then hear from Harvard's president, Larry Bacow.
Teaching alongside Ambassador Bosworth was an experience of a lifetime. It was amazing to see the transformative impact he had on the next generation.
Ambassador Bosworth was the reason I chose to attend the Harvard Kennedy School.
First encountered Ambassador Bosworth with the team class that he taught with John Park, IGA 685.
Seeing a man who had met and dealt with presidents and dictators, and here he was in our classroom telling us about and instructing us on how to negotiate without any airs about him. He talked to us like colleagues.
Whether it was with a Lutheran pastor or a North Korean negotiator, I suspect forging personal connections across differences was part of Ambassador Bosworth's effectiveness as a diplomat.
Ambassador Bosworth taught me how to bring empathy and understanding to the negotiating room.
A lot of the lessons he taught us didn't apply only to negotiations, but they applied across our lives as well.
How thoughtful he was about wanting to pass information and knowledge along to future policymakers.
What he taught us was that the other side winning was your responsibility, so you needed to find a way to help them win.
Ambassador Bosworth helped me recognize the importance of setting aside time for family, especially after a career as long and demanding as his was.
Instead of just taking the time for himself, he reinvested that in the next generation of future diplomats, military members like myself, future leaders.
Ambassador Bosworth taught us to take a collaborative approach to policy formulation, negotiation, and implementation. I put these lessons into practice every day at the Department of State.
Ambassador Steve Bosworth had a major impact on our students at Harvard while he was with us. Through this annual lecture, we hope to keep his life's work as a diplomat on full view at center stage at Harvard University.
Good afternoon. I'm Larry Bacow, president of Harvard University, and I'm honored to welcome you to the inaugural Stephen W. Bosworth Memorial Lecture in Diplomacy. This is a bittersweet moment for me. Steve and I met when I was president of Tufts, and he was dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. We traveled the world together during my tenure, and he became a dear friend, actually an unforgettable friend. Steve was an extraordinary diplomat who had an incredible career, but those of us who had the good fortune to get to know him personally and to travel with him especially, got to see something exceedingly rare, a person who was the same with virtually every person he met. No matter where in the world he found himself, Steve put people at ease. He was amiable, he was witty, he was funny, he was intelligent, and he was very, very smart. In government and in academia, there's sometimes competition to see who can be the smartest person in the room. However, in most organizations, wisdom is actually a much scarcer resource than intellect. And when Steve was in the room, there was never a doubt as to who was the wisest person. He had charisma, and those of us who shared some of his path in life will always remember him. In many ways, I think all of us who knew and loved Steve were inspired by him and wanted to be in some small measure like him. Now it's my pleasure to welcome our inaugural speaker, another friend of Steve's and a fellow charismatic, the 42nd President of the United States of America, the Honorable William Jefferson Clinton. I know how eager we all are to hear from our very distinguished guest, so I will dispense with his biography. I just want to say thank you, President Clinton, for being here today and for devoting your life to public service, something which we care about deeply, both at Harvard's Kennedy School and the university more broadly. We're grateful for your service in office, but also for your exemplary service in your post-presidential life. All of our lives are better for it, And we look forward to the opportunity to hear from you this afternoon in conversation with our friend and colleague, Professor Nick Burns of the Kennedy School. Unfortunately, there's no Zoom capability for a standing ovation, but I think we can safely assume that that reception is taking place as we speak right now. So Nick, President Clinton, the virtual floor is now yours. Thank you both very much.
President Bacow, thank you very, very much for that kind tribute to our friend, Ambassador Steve Bosworth, and welcome everybody to this session, the first ever Steve Bosworth Memorial Lecture in American Diplomacy. And what a pleasure it is to welcome President Bill Clinton to Harvard University, albeit virtually. And Mr. President, thank you for being with us as we honor someone you knew quite well, your ambassador to the Republic of Korea, Steve Bosworth. Welcome.
Thanks, Nick. I'm glad to be here. I want to thank President Bacow for the welcome. The last time I saw him, he was still president of Tufts, and I delivered a lecture there on the Middle East. It was a memorable night, and I want to thank you for the wonderful work you did in the years we worked together, especially in Russia with Ash Carter. I know he's on the Zoom. And you told me shortly before we started the program that Strobe Talbot, in a way, we all work for Strobe on the Russia issues, that he's on the Zoom too. So I'm very grateful to all of you, and I'm grateful that you're trying to teach a whole new generation of people about how to win without war whenever possible.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. And as we also said, you've got a lot of supporters here at Harvard. Larry Summers, Graham Allison, Ash Carter, and I all worked for you on Russian and Ukrainian affairs at that amazing time when the Soviet Union had disintegrated. And I wanted to ask you about that today. And for those watching this and listening, I'm going to ask President Clinton a series of questions about the major foreign policy issues that he confronted as president and how they might relate to our situation today. But first, I've got to say, Mr. President, when I think back to your time in office, those 8 years, it was really the apex of American power. We may have been more powerful in the world in your 8 years as president than we've ever been in the history of the United States. I mean, the Soviet Union disintegrated. China was not a strategic rival. After your first couple of years and your successful economic programs, our economy was humming, there was prosperity, and we had self-confidence as a country about our global role. And one of the issues that you focused on first, I was working for you at the NSC, was Russia. How do we help the Russians to lift themselves up to become a democracy? And for me as a diplomat, I thought your major achievement was really to create a relationship of trust with Boris Yeltsin, your counterpart. So I think it'd be interesting to start there. What did you think of him? How did you build that relationship as you went forward?
Well, first of all, let's go back to them. From the day I took office, I realized that we were at a unique moment where America had unprecedented economic, military, and political influence, and that there was no way it would last forever. Events would intervene, things would happen, China would rise, all these things would happen. I thought it was my job to try to build a world that America would be happy to be a leader in, but could no longer dominate. A world that would be as safe and fruitful as possible for the people of our country and as many other countries as we could persuade that we should work together. So Russia was really important to me because it's a great country with a storied history, and they were in bad shape when I took office. The collapse of the Soviet Empire, the Warsaw Pact, even the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and they literally could not afford to bring their soldiers home from the Baltic states because they didn't have any place for them to live. It's hard to remember. This was before the price of oil went way up, and they were able to modernize their pipes and drilling, and they didn't have any money. And I didn't think that humiliation was a very good strategy. I thought we needed to help them build in a positive way, because keep in mind, when Boris Yeltsin was elected president of Russia first in 1990, and then later assumed leadership of what was left of the Soviet Union, and then Russia again. It was very difficult. So the very first meeting I had with a foreign leader was in Vancouver in the spring of 1993 with Boris Yeltsin to try to help secure what seems like pittance today, and after all we've been through, but it was a lot of money back then. They wanted and needed $24 billion to be able to bring their troops home, take care of them, meet some other basic needs, and try to resume their effort to build a competitive economy, which I think went too heavy early on the privatization, because it enabled all the oligarchs to form, and all the complications we've had from that in the years since. So we met, and Strobe was there, and we had our whole team, and I'm glad you mentioned Larry and Graham. We had a chance, I thought, to get off to a good start, and we did. And I liked Yeltsin. I was telling you before we started that people would say, well, Yeltsin drank too much, and I was reminded that's what some of Ulysses Grant's critics said about him in the American Civil War. And President Lincoln is alleged to have said at one of his receptions in the White House to other Union soldiers that they should find out whatever Grant was drinking and give it to his other officers, because he would fight and he was good at it. Yeltsin, I think, was the best leader we could have gotten out of Russia at that time. He was militantly anti-communist. He did not want to see a military type dictatorship replace it. He was trying to build an inclusive society and navigating all these rough currents. And so I decided to try to help him. And the thing I liked about Yeltsin, and this is something all of the students, particularly listening to us, Yeltsin trusted his own judgment enough to override his his advisors, when he thought they were looking backward too much. On the other hand, I never saw him disregard evident facts. And he was a very interesting guy, he grew up in extreme poverty. He and his wife were both, I thought, were incredibly interesting and admirable people in many ways. So I liked working with him, and I think we got a lot done.
Well, you certainly did. If you think back on it, you expanded the G7 to include Russia as the 8th member of the G7. In addition to the American economic aid, you went to Tokyo that summer of '93 to engineer major World Bank IMF aid. And as you mentioned, there were thousands, tens of thousands of Russian troops in Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia when you became president. And you launched a major initiative with Yeltsin to try to remove them. And you and I were talking a couple of months ago about this. It was extraordinary. You went to Congress, and Congress built several thousand housing units in Russia so that Yeltsin could bring the officers back and explain this. But that was the personal diplomacy where you worked that out.
Yeah, we did. And it made a big difference. I remember I later went to, you'll remember this, I went to Latvia. And we had 40,000 people holding candles at a nighttime ceremony celebrating the fact that they and their neighbors were free, and they were free or about to be free of Russian troop presence. And that was very important. And we did try to help, as you pointed out, Yeltsin build his own economy, and we launched a whole set of negotiations about weapons reductions and trying to secure a better future with that. So I felt good about it. It's one of the things that I believe we did the right thing on, and I regret that we couldn't do even more, partly because the Congress, for example, was unwilling to ratify the Senate, the Test Ban Treaty, and some other things we tried to do. But it was a good time on balance for U.S.-Russia relations.
It was, and I remember your speech in Freedom Square in Riga in Latvia. Those countries, of course, had been forcibly incorporated into the USSR for 50 years, and suddenly, because the troops were gone, they were truly independent. And this leads to the last question on the subject of Russia. It's about modern Russia. In the last year of your presidency, Vladimir Putin came to power, and you had to deal with him. And of course, now I think we describe him as one of the major adversaries of the United States. Did you see that? Could you see that in your early conversations with Putin, or is that all ahead of us?
Well, I could see that it was a potential. I remember I always enjoyed my private conversations with Putin because I could be brutally frank with him and he would be brutally frank with me. And I felt that he was, shooting it straight. But I was trying to get Putin he was president for about 6 months before I left office. So I went to try to see him, and we had an agreement on trying to withdraw forces, both of us, the Russians and NATO, a way to defuse tensions. And I wanted to implement this agreement we had made, and he said, no, I'm not going to do it. He said, if Gore wins, will he do the deal? I said, yes. He said, I know usually you Americans follow foreign policy commitments of the previous administration, but I think you're growing too divided in America. I don't think Bush will do that. So I'll get all the grief for compromising with America and none of the benefits if Bush wins. But if Gore wins, he'll need a victory as soon as he gets in, and I'll give it to him. And it made perfect sense from his point of view. So I thought, well, maybe we can work with him. But it was clear that his model for Russian greatness was basically the czars. He wanted to go back to Mother Russia as a great, powerful country that could, at the very least, dominate its near neighbors, which you've seen over and over again in his relations with Ukraine and in many other areas. And I just felt that his whole view of this would lead him toward trying to become an authoritarian ruler. And he went through you remember after I left, he went through a little, moves back and forth. He became prime minister and Mr. Medvedev became president. And then they switched around again. And then finally he threw away the pretenses and basically said, I want to govern for life. I remember Strobe and I went to see Boris Yeltsin when he had retired. He was living out of his dacha outside Moscow, and we drove out and sat and talked with him. And I said, I know why you picked Putin to succeed you. Because he was sick then. And he'd already lived 10 years. It's hard to believe this, but the life expectancy for Russian men had dropped. I believe at one point it bottomed out at under 60. And so in his second term, I was pleased when Yeltsin was reelected, but he literally didn't have the cardiovascular capacity to work with great concentration for much more than 4 hours a day. And he knew he needed somebody who was all in, who could put in those 12 and 14-hour days and build up Russia and deal with all the details. I think he wanted a strong ruler. I also think he thought Putin would protect his family from retribution when he left for sins real and imagined. But I was really worried about it, and I looked at him, and I remember Strove and I were talking to Yeltsin just as if it were yesterday, and I said, I'm just not sure this guy shares your vision of the future and our cooperation and our building a world where we work together. And I could tell that he was worried about it too.
Well, when I think back to your presidency, the fact that you're able to expand NATO to 3 countries and get the Russian troops out of the Baltic states and Poland, you think about what would have happened if that hadn't been accomplished. Putin, I think, would have been over the border into those countries.
I was, this is a gross oversimplification, but my basic theory in all uncertain circumstances is work like crazy for the best and prepare for the worst. And I remember I was criticized by a lot of columnists for sparking a Russian reaction by embarrassing them, by putting these countries in NATO. But I remember the private meeting I had with Yeltsin about it, when he was telling me we shouldn't let Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic in and leave the door open for all these others. And I said, Boris, do you really believe that I would use an air base in Poland to bomb Russia? And he laughed and he said, no, but a lot of little old ladies in Russia do. He said, you have to realize our nightmare is invasion. We had Napoleon and we had Hitler. And I said, okay, then what we should do is work together. And, we worked for a NATO-Russia agreement. We set up the Partnership for Peace and had, at one time, more than 40 other countries who did military exercises with us. I invited them to be a part of it. I said, you even ought to consider joining NATO if you are prepared to meet the standards. But Putin never thought like that. He wanted to reestablish Russia's empire and dominance. And again, I thought we should all be thinking of a world when none of us could dominate on our own. And it's a sad thing, but yes, I did see it, and so did Boris Yeltsin.
That policy you started of expanding NATO was followed by President Bush, George W. Bush, by President Obama, and by President Trump, and is now being followed by President Biden. It's been remarkably successful if you think about our relations with Russia. I also wanted to ask you, of course, about China, because we've had a lot of continuity in our relationship with China over many decades. You worked with Jiang Zemin principally and others, and it was a stable relationship. China was not a strategic threat to the United States at that time. We had solid economic relationships. Your administration facilitated China's entry into the WTO. That's been criticized. A lot of people now criticize it. Did we miss something in China's trajectory, all of us working at that time forward, or have the Chinese just fundamentally changed under Xi Jinping, their orientation?
Well, I think the answer is a little bit of both. I think one of the things that we had to be prepared to do once we took China into the WTO is to realize that they would try to do 2 mutually inconsistent things. And you would have too if you'd been running China. That is, let's give them credit, they moved more people out of extreme poverty in less time than any entity in all of history. They were doing remarkable things. But they wanted it both ways. They wanted to be treated like a wealthy, powerful country when policymaking took place and when they were in all these units. But they wanted to act like they were still a poor country when it came to taking advantage around the edges of all the trade rules. So there's no question they would manipulate a currency, for example, and do other things to try to create more jobs in China and fewer jobs elsewhere. And later, there's no question that they tried to, in effect, use their international position to solve some of the problems they created. For example, there are tens and tens of millions of acres of farmland in China that can't safely grow food because it's been polluted. So they tried to buy or lease farmland all over the world and use their foreign aid, in effect, to muscle people into doing that. And lots of other things that we all know. And then when President Xi came in, it was clear that he was riding the nationalist tailwinds that were blowing all over the world. And he wanted to be a strong leader. And once he decided he wanted to stay for life, for as long as he could stay, it changed things. It changes things if you have it. When Putin's governing for life, it changes things. Then you think you can get away with anything, including killing people in foreign countries. When Xi came in, it changed three things that affected the way other people felt they could deal with China. He put the Uyghurs in the camps, over 1 million of them. He clearly broke his promise to Hong Kong to have one country, two systems. And then he increased the militarization of the South China Sea and beyond, trying to control his smaller neighbors, which is, of course, why President Obama tried in large measure so hard to get the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So it's changed now, and it's different. But what hasn't changed is the Chinese still really want to take care of their home turf and build prosperity. And they clearly are willing to exercise influence around the world in ways that they have a competitive advantage. They have a 40% savings rate, and we don't. So they built a railroad in East Africa, for example. And they're getting better at exercising international commercial diplomacy. They made a mess of the mining in South America, for example, but they're getting better at it. And I think we have no choice but to work with them. We're not about to go to war with them right now, but we don't want them to run over their neighbors. I know when Hillary was Secretary of State, she spent an enormous amount of time trying to, deal with that problem. So my view is with China, our work for the best, prepare for the worst scenario means that we have to do everything we can to cooperate with them in fighting climate change. There are lots of win-win solutions there that may reduce tensions everywhere. We have to counter their attempts to dominate small countries around the world, which they're trying to do, which we can do perfectly well by doing good things. A lot of these countries would rather deal with us because they know we're not trying to run them. But we also have to be prepared for things that may yet happen. The most troubling thing I think President Xi has said is that he doesn't want to pass the problem of Taiwan on to his successors. Look, Taiwan is a problem unless you're just totally hung up on control. It's solving itself. There are millions upon millions of people in China working for companies controlled by Taiwan or Taiwanese interests. There are all kinds of ways to skin this cat, and I'm afraid he's going to make it worse by trying to solve a problem that really doesn't exist.
Well, we're certainly seeing the transformation of this relationship from your time as president to President Biden's time. It's just night and day. Most Republicans and most Democrats now think we've got to be competitive. We've got to compete with China, so force them to play by the rules economically on trade and investment, hold our ground militarily. That's the quad that President Biden is developing with Japan, Australia, and India. And we got to speak up for democracy and human rights and defend our turf, because there's an ideological component to Xi Jinping as well. very competitive. And on the one issue that I want to ask you about, North Korea, we're going to have to find a way to work with them, just as we do on climate change. One of our students, Mr. President, junior at Harvard College, is Winston Mahalik. He's actually one of our research assistants in my program. Winston's from Evanston, Illinois. He's going to graduate a year from now. And Winston's question to you is, you dealt a lot with the North Korea problem. You had some success early on. What are the key elements for us right now to try to do something about diminishing and curtailing and containing North Korea's nuclear weapons program?
Well, I think first of all, we do need to work with China, with Russia, with all the parties that have been involved in this for decades now. I think it also matters a lot, our ability to do anything, what the attitude of the government of South Korea is. Keep in mind, I was very fortunate. I was president when Kim Dae-jung became president of South Korea with his sunshine policy. And when Kim Jong-il had been in long enough and was secure enough and was open enough to embrace it, we get the worst of both worlds when you have like the current ruler of North Korea, who was insecure when he first took office and decided to, he had to kill a few people and do a lot of other things to, solidify his rule. And then during the Olympics, we had an effort by South Korea to figure out a way maybe back into some kind of cooperation. So I think that we have to, whatever the state of play is at the time, if you look at what Steve Bosworth did, for example, when I was president, my first term, we got the agreed framework in '94 with President Kim Il-sung, in the beginning, before he passed away. Then we were able to hold on to it, implement it, build on it. That's what we have to do today. I think with North Korea, you have to know what you won't do, and you have to do everything else. You just have to keep trying, because their psychological problem is that no one would ever think about them if they didn't cause trouble. Their objective problems are significant in terms of the ability to feed themselves. And I remember when I went in 2009 to North Korea to receive the 2 Chinese American journalists that they released. And I learned a lot about North Korea going, because I asked Kim Jong-il, I said, why do you want me to do this? Because he basically said, if Clinton comes, I'll give him up, and if he doesn't, I won't. I said, why'd you do this? And he said, I think you understand us. I said, why do you think that? He said, because when my father died, you were the first world leader to reach out to me and console me. And not all my friends. And he said, I always had the feeling that you understood us. I said, well, I try to do that, but I said, we're on a self-defeating cycle here. And I really tried to help put, in 2009, Kim Jong-il back in a let's make a deal framework. At the same time, your honoree, Steve Bosworth, had just agreed to be a special envoy on the Korean problem for Secretary of State Clinton and President Obama. And I pleaded with him to see Bosworth. And I said, look, I can't cut this deal. That's not my job anymore. I don't make policy. We only have one president at a time. But you need to do this. And I thought he might, but it turned out he was I think, sicker than we thought he was at the time, and it never happened. And I think it's a great tragedy because I think if Steve Bosworth had been able to work with him for a couple of years, I think we'd be in a better place than we are today.
Well, thank you for that. And Mr. President, I know we've only got a couple of minutes left. I want to ask you another question from another of our students. Her name is Michelle Nearbubble. She's from the Marianas Islands, from Saipan. She's a Payne Fellow, so she's training to go into the State Department. And given all the work you've done with the Clinton Health Access Initiative, she wonders how will the pandemic change our perspective, your perspective, on global health issues and U.S. foreign policy in terms of the prominence of those issues going forward?
Well, first of all, I think you have to assume that there will be more viral and bacteriological problems that will spread across the world, either by design or, in the worst case, or just because we're living in an interdependent world and these things are going to happen. So I think we need to strengthen the World Health System. I think the World Health Organization has performed better now than they did during the Ebola crisis. I think Mr. Tedros, the president of the World Health Organization, is a very able man, and I have a high regard for him, and I think we need to continue to build the capacity there. And then I think that here's a case where we ought to be cooperating. I think the major economies all over the world should sit when we've got this under control and plan the kind of stockpiles that we need to deal with these things when they break out, and then should plan a joint research effort to try to nip them in the bud. There was an amazing cultural difference in the way this has played out. If you look at South Korea, for example, they announced their first case of COVID about, I think, on exactly the same day we did. And their death rate has been, I think, maybe 1/50th of ours or something, much, much lower, because they immediately went to masks. They knew what they were doing, and they were able to carry on with much of their economy. We need to do a real comparative study of how all this was responded to, and set up public health systems and networks around the world that will help. I know a lot of the African countries have done better so far than anybody thought they would. And there are several in which the Clinton Health Access Initiative has worked on a permanent basis, more or less. And so we did a lot of work on COVID. We were asked to come into the World Health Organization to help them prepare, and it was an honor to do what we could. But we don't have a system, really. And, we have a whole arms control apparatus. You can argue that we ought to be doing more than we are, but we have it. We know how to do that. And that needs to become an integral part of international relations. Global health management, we need to see public health as indispensable to the future. And not just with outbreaks, but, and it's not just for poor countries. We have been in a period when, before COVID replaced everything else, we had a surprising number of people dying in the United States in hospitals from sepsis. We had a surprising number of people who were dying from bacterial infections they'd gotten from international travel. I had a friend who got the best health care he could get on the West Coast, who died from a still undiagnosed bacterial infection he got in France. He could have gotten passing somebody in an airport. So we need this, and I hope there are a lot of young people looking at this program who will want to be part of building an international health corps and systems that will really make this kind of difference, because it ought to become an integral part of our foreign and domestic diplomatic policy.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. You know, we have a School of Public Health here, the Chance School at Harvard. I think that school is going to become even more important to us.
They were very good to, my daughter and I went there a few years ago, and they gave her an award, and then she came back a couple of years later and gave her a lecture. I think it's a wonderful place, but the schools of public health are going to have to, we need them not only to build a better public health system in America, which we clearly don't have now, and to do more work around the world. We need to integrate that with what we're doing. And next to climate change, it's probably our most important non-traditional security problem.
I think you're right. I see it in my students who in another decade, they might have gone into Russian affairs during the Cold War, but now they want to do some good on public health on the front line. So it's encouraging to see our students respond to this. Mr. President.
NGOs, the other thing is there are all these great NGOs out there that students can affiliate with, learn from, work with, and start their own. I mean, it doesn't all have to be done through the government, but the governments of the world have to establish the frameworks, the bare bones.
Well, and we're seeing a lot of student idealism is to start their own organizations or to expand in the NGO sector, not just to go into formal federal government structures. But this is certainly an area we're going to see a lot more focus here at the Kennedy School, and we certainly will see it around the world. Mr. President, we would love to have you come actually to Harvard when we reopen, perhaps in the autumn or the winter of next year, because if we'd had more time, I would have wanted to pay tribute to what you did to bring peace with our mutual friend to Northern Ireland. And also to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and also to bring, I think, focus to economic diplomacy. There's so much you did in foreign policy. We wanted to honor you for that, and we also, of course, want to honor Ambassador Steve Bosworth. So thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Nick, and thanks to all of you. I love this, and I know Chris is here, and I hope every one of the students here who didn't know Steve Bosworth will learn about his career. He lived a wonderful life. He did a lot of good, and he never felt he was the total psychological opposite to what we see today, where we all want to get off in our self-enclosed positions and battle the other. This us and them business is killing us in America, and it's bad business for diplomacy. Most people are struggling either in the right or the wrong direction, but we have to stumble in the right direction. And to do that, you've got to have a theory of the case pretty much like Steve had for his entire life. And I think we can make a big difference. I think America's, getting its sea legs back. But at the beginning, there has to be a fundamental respect for other people as people, and a belief that we can reconcile, that we can do better, that we can make progress, and that it's a fool's errand to sit in the bleachers and badmouth each other if we can build something better.
That's certainly true. And, we wanted to honor diplomacy and Steve's commitment with this annual lecture, which has been made possible, by the way, by two very good friends of Steve and Chris's and of mine, and that's Kathy and Jim Stone. But I reflect on your administration. You're the one who brought Madeleine Albright into a prominent role in government, and Strobe Talbot and George Mitchell on Northern Ireland, and Steve Bosworth on Korea. So thank you for believing in the promise of diplomacy. And Mr. President, now we're going to hear from Chris Bosworth herself. She's going to conclude the program with a tribute, she and her grandson, with a tribute to her husband and his grandfather. And so let's listen to Chris Bosworth.
My husband Steve spent the last years of his life doing what he so enjoyed, teaching and mentoring future diplomats and leaders. I want to thank both Graham Allison and Gary Seymour, who made it possible for Steve to serve as a senior fellow at the Belfer Center. I thank John Park for his thoughtfulness, kindness, and being a superb teaching partner with Steve at the Kennedy School, as we heard echoed in the students' testimonials earlier. I want to thank Steve's and my friend and exemplary leader, Larry Backow, for his kind words about my husband. My sincere thanks to Ambassador Nick Burns for memorializing and continuing Steve's commitment to diplomacy, peacekeeping, and educating future practitioners with this lecture series. I also want to thank all those who worked to make this program happen. He loved you all. Seeing the memorial video, our grandson wanted to say a few words.
In the words of the American novelist Chuck Palahniuk, the goal is not to live forever. It is to create something that will. Through Grandpa Steve's dedication to not only his work, but also to his family, he made sure that kids like me would grow up living in a safer America. I am inspired by his legacy. I learned a lot from him, but most importantly, that listening is the most important form of communication. We miss him, and he would be so appreciative of this event.
Steve was a realist, and as a diplomat, he treated everyone with fairness and respect, while being tough-minded about American interests. He never demonized those he was negotiating with, diplomats defending their interests with their own history, culture, and challenges. He said in order for there to be agreement, goodwill, and common ground, the other guy has to win something too. He valued listening to differing opinions so that he could evaluate his own. We believed that diplomacy is an antidote to war. I know Steve would be honored to know that President Clinton inaugurated this lecture series. As I told the president earlier, I have a vivid memory of his trip to Seoul in 1998, and that he and my husband drove up and back to the DMZ talking about negotiating with North Korea. The president had already signed the 1994 agreed framework and continued a serious effort during his 2 terms to denuclearize North Korea. When Steve came home that night from the DMZ, he had been so impressed with President Clinton's diplomatic acumen and believed he was savvy in knowing the tools of diplomacy, tact in difficult situations, and sensitivity so not to arouse hostility. Individuals make a difference. Steve used to talk about timing. So I hope in the future that the Biden administration will call on President Clinton. Let us hope that politics does not interfere with the possibility of deterrence on the Korean Peninsula and future peace in Northeast Asia. Steve was my soulmate. I miss him. We all miss him, and he would be so grateful for this forum.
Many, many thanks to Mrs. Chris Bosworth for those beautiful words in tribute to her husband and our honoree today, Ambassador Steve Bosworth. Many thanks to President Bill Clinton for being with us. He honored us with his presence today. I want to thank our president, our great president of Harvard University, Larry Backow, and our great dean of the Kennedy School, Doug Elmendorf. Thanks to everybody who participated, and good afternoon.